Good morning and welcome to Morning Joe. It is Thursday, October 3rd. A happy New Year to our Jewish friends. Along with Willie and me, we have the host of Way Too Early, White House Bureau Chief at Politico, Jonathan Lemire, U.S. Special Correspondent for BBC News, Katty Kay, co-host of MSNBC's The Weekend, former chair of the Republican National Committee, Michael Steele, and former U.S. attorney and MSNBC contributor, Chuck Rosenberg. And Willie, the first line of Jack Smith's 165-page filing, the defendant, Donald Trump, asserts that he's immune from prosecution for his criminal scheme to overturn the 2020 presidential election because he claims it entailed official conduct. Not so. And he goes on to explain why.
Yeah, the special counsel seeking to make the case and to pierce the immunity argument made by the Supreme Court over the summer. And we are now getting an in-depth look at Jack Smith's election interference case against Donald Trump. A judge yesterday unsealed Smith's filing in response to the Supreme Court's ruling on presidential immunity. In it, Smith argues Trump was not acting as president of the United States when he sought to overturn his 2020 election loss. Although his multiple conspiracies began after Election Day in 2020, the defendant laid the groundwork for the crimes well before then. Smith goes on to write, that same day, in an implicit acknowledgement that he had no lawful way to prevail, the defendant sidelined the existing campaign staff responsible for mounting his legal challenges, who were telling the defendant the truth that he did not want to hear, which is that he had lost. The defendant turned to a private attorney who was willing to falsely claim victory and spread knowingly false claims of election fraud. Smith argues in the brief, Trump knew his claims of outcome-determinative fraud were false, writing, following Election Day and throughout the charged conspiracies, the defendant, his co-conspirators, and their agents spread lies that there had been fraud in the election that he had actually won. Smith details conversations between Vice President Mike Pence and Trump in which Pence told Trump he had seen no evidence of fraud in the election. Pence, Smith writes, gradually and gently tried to convince the defendant to accept the lawful results of the election, even if it meant the defendant lost. Smith also highlights Trump's speech on January 6, writing, the defendant repeated the same lies about election fraud in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin that had been publicly or directly debunked. The defendant used these lies to inflame and motivate the large and angry crowd of his supporters to march to the Capitol and disrupt the certification proceeding. The filing from Smith details another conversation between Trump and Pence on January 1st, where the former vice president explained he did not believe he had the power under the Constitution to decide which votes to accept. Trump then told Pence, quote, hundreds of thousands of people are going to hate your guts and people are going to think you're stupid, and berated Pence pointedly, quote, you're too honest. Smith argues even if the court determines these conversations were official, the government can rebut the presumption of immunity because the use of this evidence poses no risk to executive branch prerogatives. The content of the conversations at issue, the defendant and Pence's joint electoral fate and how to accept the election results, have no bearing on any function of the executive branch.
And we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
So, of course, that is Donald Trump back on January 6, 2021. Chuck Rosenberg. So this is 165 pages, as Mika said. There's a lot to sift through, a lot of detail. It's clear that a lot of the testimony is coming directly from Mike Pence, among other people who are around Donald Trump. But it seems to me, and I'll let you walk us through and explain, the core argument here is that Donald Trump was not acting as president. He was acting as a presidential candidate, effectively, when talking to Mike Pence about these things.
I think that's exactly right, Willie. The Supreme Court said that certain official conduct is off limits, that a president, any president, Mr. Trump in this case, would be immune from prosecution for official acts. And so the government's brief here, it's styled as a motion for the judge to make determinations about immunity. But the thrust of the government's brief here, Willie, is that Mr. Trump was not acting in an official capacity. He was acting in a private capacity as a candidate, not as a president, but as a candidate trying to secure re-election. And so all of those 165 pages have a similar theme. They lay out a series of acts of conversations between the president and private officials, for the most part, explaining that the president was willfully blind to the facts that he had lost, that he was urging people to act in fraudulent and dishonest ways, and that he's trying to retain office. All of this is intended to convince the district court judge, the trial judge, Judge Chutkan, that these are all prosecutable acts, that they're not immune. Remember, the Supreme Court had the easy job, Willie. All they had to do was pronounce a rule. Judge Chutkan has the really hard job. She has to implement the rule. And the government is trying to give her a path, a roadmap to implement the rule in a way that they believe means that Mr. Trump still may be prosecuted for all of these unofficial acts as a candidate.
Interesting. So, Chuck, boy, this goes into the relationship with Pence in a big way. The different efforts in different states to try and change the outcome. Also, Trump's tweets, making it very clear, by the way, that it was him tweeting. But he goes through tweets as a candidate, casting doubt on election integrity, tweets making false claims of election fraud, tweets and retweets attacking those speaking the truth about the election, tweets exhorting individuals to travel to Washington, D.C. for the Save America rally, tweets regarding Pence's role on January 6th, the defendant's 2:24 p.m. tweet on January 6th. I mean, it is very specific that these tweets were done by Trump. But my question is, how can you separate his official capacities to his unofficial capacities, therefore not immune, if there's still a transition that is underway? Does that make sense?
It does make sense, Mika, and it's precisely the right question. Again, very easy for the Supreme Court to proclaim, very hard to implement. It's like my 9th grade algebra teacher. She can simply say, I have to work harder, study better, and get my grades up. Easy for her to say that.
Right.
Much harder for me to do it. And so the Supreme Court has said that official acts are out of bounds, they're immune. All right, now, Judge Chutkan, you figure it out. You tell us which acts you think are prosecutable. So the government's making its case that everything in its 165-page brief is prosecutable. It's all evidence that may be adduced to trial, and that it could be used by a jury if they see fit to convict Mr. Trump of the fraud with which he is charged. But to your point, Mika, some of this stuff, and I have no doubt Mr. Trump's attorneys will argue that some of this stuff is official conduct, particularly, right, conversations that Mr. Trump had with his then vice president. So I think this is a very difficult task for Judge Chutkan. I was not able to get my grades up in algebra. Easy for my teacher to say I should, harder for me to do it. And so this is just the opening salvo in what I think is going to be a long, difficult stretch of pretrial litigation.
Well, that was one of my questions, was if you thought this was going to be a tough slog to push this through with the judge. But secondly, was there anything in here that surprised you?
Not really. I mean, this reads a little bit like a trial brief or a trial memorandum. Sometimes before a complex trial, prosecutors, and I've done this, will file a trial brief telling the district court what they should expect from various witnesses, so there's no surprises. This is not styled as a trial brief. This is styled as a motion for the judge to make immunity determinations. But it really lays out much more of the government's evidence. I don't know that it's all of it, but it's probably most of it, at least in broad strokes. And so they're doing this because they have to adduce at trial evidence that is not immune. They have to introduce at trial evidence that can be used to convict Mr. Trump. Remember, Mika, the government has already superseded their indictment. They've already struck from the original indictment passages that they believe are clearly immune. So the government has arrived at a place where they think they have the right stuff and the right balance of stuff that is not immune from prosecution to push this case forward. Now, does the judge agree? We shall see.
Donald Trump was asked about the unsealing of this brief yesterday, the redacted brief, in an interview last night. Here's what he said.
This was a weaponization of government, and that's why it was released 30 days before the election. And it's nothing new in there, by the way, nothing new. They rigged the election. I didn't rig the election. They rigged the election.
Okay, so Jonathan Lemire, he said someone else rigged the election. We can sift through that a little bit later. But if you look through these 165 pages, just some of the detail, which again is not terribly surprising based on the reporting we've seen, based on that volume produced by the House committee on January 6th and on the election of 2020. But there are some moments that stand out, as when an aide came up to Donald Trump on January 6th as he sat scrolling Twitter and watching Fox News and said, your vice president, Mike Pence's life is in danger. The Secret Service has rushed him. He's not safe right now. And Donald Trump is alleged to have said, quote, so what? When approached by his daughter, Ivanka, and her husband, Jared Kushner, confronted, he said, according to this brief, it doesn't matter if you won or lost. You still have to fight like hell. What stood out to you here, John, as somebody who wrote an entire book about this day and all the events around it?
I mean, you're right, Willie. No real surprises in here, but vivid detail. And you just tick through some of them. Trump's utter callousness and uncaring on January 6th when there was violence to the point that put his own vice president's life in danger. We have also in here an unnamed campaign aide from an earlier moment actually saying, make them riot. When there was a disturbance at another campaign office. This was part of the plan to stir unrest, to fight, to intimidate, to try to overturn the will of the people. And, Caddy, you know, this comes, Donald Trump claims this is election interference. Two rebuttals to that. First of all, let's remember in 2016, James Comey's letter about the FBI investigation to Hillary Clinton came about a week before the election. This is much further out. Also, the reason why this is coming out now is because of Donald Trump's legal team's own delay tactics, the push that they have made, and then the Supreme Court decision about immunity, which Jack Smith is trying now to circumvent. So I don't think this quite qualifies as an October surprise, but it is a reminder to so many Americans what Trump did, what those years were like, what another Trump presidency could be like. Do you think it is going to matter this election?
I think you're right that, I mean, we've got a lot of October surprises, and we're only, into day 3 or day 4 of October, and there are a ton out there, most of them around the world. I don't think this does count as one. So far, every time that Donald Trump has had some kind of a legal setback, and I think, you know, what Chuck was saying earlier about whether this is a hard slog for Jack Smith to define whether this was his role as a candidate or his role as a president, given that he was both at the same time. So how do you distinguish between the two? But every time he's had this in the past, he's used it to raise more money. So on the Trump side, they feel this doesn't set them back necessarily. I think it is interesting that this kind of sheds light on J.D. Vance's last few moments of the debate. When you hear what Donald Trump was saying last night about, I didn't rig the election. I mean, they rigged the election. In other words, again, saying the election was stolen because it was a fake outcome, according to Donald Trump. That is why J.D. Vance was put in that position at the end of that debate. It's a tough one for him to get through.
And both candidates talked about that on the campaign trail yesterday. Let's take a listen.
When you're governor, congressman, you're trying to solve problems, wherever you want a straight answer on something. The moment that really stuck out is I just asked the simplest of all questions that every single American should be able to answer. I asked him if Donald Trump lost the 2020 election.